Appreciate those prayerful songs that we've sung tonight, and our psalm tonight is like that too. If you got a Bible, you can go ahead and be turning to Psalm 131. It's the one that Walter just read for us a moment ago. Psalm 131, our psalm for tonight. That was not just a selection of it. That's the psalm. It's a short little psalm, 3 verses long, and I'd like to read it again. It says this. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. So, we've been talking about Psalms in this series for quite some time. The most recent part of our series, we've been talking about Psalms with a little bit of context to them, Psalms with a story attached. And if you know what's going on around this psalm, then it's going to maybe bring it to life for you. And we've looked at several different examples of that. Tonight's psalm, this little psalm, Psalm 131, is a psalm like that too. There's actually one or two different bits of biblical context that I think really brings this psalm to life. But the bit of context I want to start with tonight is more of a personal one. I cannot tell you how many times I have mumbled the words of this psalm here, just quietly to myself, while I stand in front of the front pew here, as we stand and sing, and I fumble with my microphone and straighten up my tie as I'm getting ready to preach a sermon. This psalm has been a frequent pre-sermon prayer for me. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I've calmed and quieted my soul. And there's a reason that this psalm has so often spoken to me in those moments right before I preach a sermon. Because preaching is one of those things, actually it's just one of many, many things like this in life, but preaching is one of those things where the thing you're trying to accomplish is so much greater than you are, greater than I am. It's like something that I try to do that's more important and more weighty than I'm capable of or what I'm qualified to do. And so I can shape and reshape a sentence so very carefully all week long. But then I get up here and I remember that I can't shape and reshape a heart. But that's what a sermon is supposed to do. And I could crack open all the books I want and study all week long, but how does somebody crack open the door of someone's soul to let God's message come in? And it's God's message, too. I wonder, how many times I get in the way of that with my own preoccupations and my little anecdotes and the jokes that fall flat and, the different things that I think are important, my own stubbornness sometimes to let God's message into my heart, to open up my soul. I do the best that I can, but and I sure do, that this whole thing about preaching is, to use the words of this psalm, it's too great and too marvelous for me. And all those truly great and marvelous things that preaching should do are things that I can't do, even at my best. And I'm not always at my best. Have I depressed you enough with all that? Here's the important thing that I'm trying to get to with all of this. those great and marvelous things that preaching is supposed to do, when I say that I can't do them, the good thing is that doesn't mean they can't be done. All I'm trying to say is the one who is sufficient to accomplish those things, it isn't me. And that's why I love this psalm so much. Maybe I can share some things with you tonight that'll help you love this psalm as much as I do. And I've prayed this psalm so many times before a sermon. Maybe you can see why. My heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I don't occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. I've calmed and quieted my soul. I've calmed and quieted my soul. Then comes this metaphor, this analogy. I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. So let's talk a little bit about some of the biblical context of this psalm, some of the part that maybe brings it to life for us. So this is a psalm that was written, this is a psalm by David, one of the many psalms written by David. I know, big surprise, right? So if you were to open up your psalms and just close your eyes and point, there's a pretty good chance you'd land on a psalm of David. This is one of them, one of the many. But I don't know about you. You read this psalm of David, it has a little different tune to it than a whole lot of his other psalms. It strikes me as being a little different. A lot of David's psalms are kind of angsty. A lot of times David's psalms are really like drawn out of these perilous situations in his life, or these pressing foes that are, it's like when he's in crisis mode that we get these psalms that are kind of born, these prayers that are born out of these crises that he's facing in his life. And so I'll give you a few examples. Psalm 63 is about this time that David spends in the wilderness. He spent so much of his life on the run. He spends time in the wilderness. And it's out of that psalm that he says, my soul thirsts for God. When will I see the Lord? This time of crisis. Psalm 54 was written out of a time when David is in hiding from Saul. Psalm 56 is a time when David was seized by the Philistines. Psalm 52, this guy named Doeg comes along and betrays David. Saul's looking for him, and Doeg stabs him in the back and tells him where he's going to be, and then off they go again, running for his life. Psalm 142, you remember that story where David was hiding in the cave? Saul ends up being there in the cave, and he's hiding out into the deepest parts of the cave, just moments from getting caught. This psalm tonight has a context too. It draws from David's experience. What's the experience? What is David doing? You can get out a Bible and look at it. He's spending time with a child. We're not sure where or when. Who knows? Maybe it would be one of David's own children. That would make sense. He had children of his own. I don't know. But this psalm speaks of a weaned child, a child that's old enough to no longer depend on their mother's milk, but young enough that you still have to describe them that way. And there in the rest of the verse, depending on what translation you read, David describes this child as being with me. So this translation here says, my soul is like the weaned child that is with me. This psalm's not inspired by David hiding in caves or running for his life or living out in the wilderness. It's not those perilous things, but it's inspired by baby, a toddler, a child. And in a way, I really love that. David, mighty David, warrior David, slayed Goliath David. They sang songs about his valor, David. He looks at this child with his mother. He says, my soul is like that. That's what my soul is like. What does it mean for your soul to be like a child? David says, my soul is like the weaned child with its mother. What does that really mean? What does it mean for your soul to be like a weaned child? What's David saying? I guess that soul is one that's calmed and quieted. A soul like that is not concerned with things too great and too marvelous. A word we might use is content. Content like a child. Now, you parents who remember the days with young children might be more hesitant than I am to use the word content about the days of a young child. Maybe you remember too well those times when your children were not so content, the tantrums, the late night crying, whatever it was that went on. But think about those other times too. Think about those times when a child is just like totally and fully, completely content in the arms of those that hold them. You know, like content to trust in arms that are stronger than their own. Content to trust that all those things that are too great and too marvelous for them to do are going to be done by someone greater than them. And David almost breathes this sigh of relief in this psalm. And he prays this prayer and he says, my soul is like that. My soul is like that child, calmed and quieted. And my eyes are not lifted up to things too great, as if I were the one responsible for doing things that I cannot do. As if I have to put on my cape again and be the hero. As if me and my skill and my strength alone must be sufficient. And David rests contented in God's strength and God's sufficiency to do all the things that he cannot do. And so David's soul depends on God. David's soul leans back like a child into the arms of his God. He rests his soul in God's care. David trusts here that God's love for him, God's value of him is not based just on what he's done for God lately. Not just about his activity, his accomplishments. Any more than a baby's accomplishments can earn their parents' love. David just leans back into God. Trusts God to do all those things that are too great and too marvelous for him. Don't you just really admire that about David? I find that very impressive when you think about the kind of things that David was dealing with on a day-to-day basis. You think about like the responsibilities that were placed on his shoulders throughout his life. And, you know, even from a young age, some of the things that David was called to do that were great challenges. I'll list a few for you here. You know, like protecting a flock of sheep Don't think I would be good at that anyway. But David has to do with that protecting a flock of sheep from lions and bears, we learn about in 1 Samuel. Even as a young boy, the youngest of his family, as a boy or as a teen, maybe he's a teenager when he does these things. And yet, his job is to protect this flock from grave danger. Like, what kind of boy or teenager is sufficient for that? I think David would say, not me. And he says as much in 1 Samuel 17. I mean, who is it that can do such a great thing as fighting the giant Goliath when you're not even old enough to be in the army? They send everybody out to war except you. You're back at home. I mean, who has the strength, the sufficiency to be up for a task like that? I think David would say, not me. Not me alone. Think about what it's like to be the king of people. I mean, it sounds great, but not really. Like protecting a nation and leading them, and you're in charge of their well-being, and you have so much responsibility on your shoulders. Like for any one person, how do you stand up to that kind of burden, that kind of responsibility? He's the child of a shepherding family, and how can you be up for this task? For David, all these tasks of what should be done that he's responsible for doing, they should be too much for him. Too great, too marvelous. But time and time again, David insists that these things are not too great for his God. They're not too marvelous for God. And David insists that the Lord will fight for him. That's what he said when he went out to face Goliath. He said, it was the Lord who saved me from the mouth of the lion and the mouth of the bear. So that's how I know that he's going to fight for me. That's how I know I'll be strong enough. Because the Lord will fight for me. David trusts that God is going to work in and through him. We know he wasn't perfect. And when the things that he faced were too much for him to face alone, David still calms and quiets his soul. And he goes to work. And he faces each great giant task, trusting that God can do what he himself cannot do, what he cannot do on his own. I think David in that way reminds me of Paul. Paul, who said about his mission, said, we're not sufficient in ourselves to claim any of this, any gains, any achievements as coming from us. But our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. Made us sufficient to do things we couldn't do on our own. I think David knows this feeling well. And that's why at times I've found this prayer so helpful to be one that I kind of keep in my back pocket, carry around with me in my heart for life. In many ways, I'm not like David, but I sure would like to be. I very rarely claim to have calmed and quieted my soul, but I'd sure like to work toward that. And when I face challenges in my life where I know that my sufficiency is never going to do the trick, I sometimes return to these words. And it humbles me to remind myself that my self-sufficiency isn't going to be enough, because sometimes I can kind of forget that. It humbles me and does a good thing for me to remember not to lift up my eyes too high. This psalm helps with that. But it also is just a source of a real comfort to me to remember how great and marvelous is our God. And He's the one who holds my soul. How sufficient and strong is the God who is able to do through me what I could never do. I wonder, maybe there's a place in your life where you might like to keep a prayer like this one tucked away in your back pocket, where you might like to hold on to something like this and come back to it somewhere for you. I use the example of preaching because that's something I know. It's something I do sometimes on Wednesdays and Sundays, and it reminds me each week of what I cannot do. But I think we have many, many situations like this in our lives. I could see this being a good prayer for people when you face an important decision about the future and you don't know for sure what the right thing to do is, or where the right place to go is, or maybe there's some things out of your control. It could be a good time to hold on to a prayer like this. I think it could be a good prayer for the student at school who's really trying hard to live like Jesus and carry their cross of discipleship in their friend group and on their sports team and, at school in the lunchroom, and it's hard. It's hard to do. Sometimes we don't have the strength to do it. I could see this being a good prayer to tuck away, for parents. It's like you're well aware of the many things you want to instill in your child, the things you want to protect them from, the things that you want them to grow toward and be able to face in this world on their own, but knowing that there's also things that are beyond our control. I could see this being a good prayer for church leaders, church elders, those who serve in great faith and have that strong foundation, but still don't have all the answers. I could see it being a good prayer for people as we face this uphill battle of trying to share the faith in a culture where a lot of times there's a lot of negative baggage for our faith that's just built up before we even get there to that conversation with your neighbor or whatever. Like maybe there's already some preconceptions there and some negative impressions there, and sometimes maybe there's things that we Christians have done that have rubbed people the wrong way in the past. And if you try to get out there into all of that and hold on to our mission, you're going to find out real quick there are things that we can't do on our own. I could see this being a prayer worth holding on to as you still try to go. We all face situations in our lives where our own sufficiency and our own strength is not enough to do those things that are too great and too marvelous for us. And so often I have this tendency for those things to make my soul very restless and loud. But what if instead those things led us straight into the arms of God? What if they led us closer? What if they were things that reminded us how to really pray and cast all our anxieties on Him because He cares for you, and address God as the one who's able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine? That's what Scripture tells us. Ephesians chapter 3, immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. Things too great and marvelous for us to see. Maybe it reminds us to really try to calm and quiet our souls. Be like that child who rests securely in the strong arms that can hold whatever it is we need. That's how I want to respond when I face my own limits. That's my work in progress. Because these words from David long ago, which of all things were just inspired by spending time with a child, maybe, they remind me of what's possible when our trust is placed properly. You know, Jesus himself once looked at the child who was with him and said, "To such as these belongs the kingdom of heaven." To children like this, God's kingdom belongs to those of us who learn to pray like this. "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great, too marvelous for me. But I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me." The last verse of this psalm reminds us that in God, we have hope from this time on and forevermore. And that is a reason to quiet our souls and rejoice in the rest, in the knowledge of the fact that God truly can do what we cannot do. So maybe this is a prayer you can carry with you. Maybe sometime in your life when you need it, you can be reminded of these words, like I have sometimes reminded myself of these words, and they really do come in handy. They can bring a humility to your life, to remember the things you can't do and can't carry. But they can also bring a sense of calm and peace to your life, to remember exactly how great and marvelous is our God. Maybe you need to respond to that tonight. Your response to that this evening could be in the way you go forth from this place in prayer. Maybe you take encouragement for one of those reasons to pray this prayer that I mentioned. You know, like in your parenting, in your daily life at work or wherever you go, in your ways to reach out. When you face those difficult decisions, you can take and apply this passage by seeking God's help and seeking God's strength in those things that we can't do on our own. Maybe somebody needs to respond to this by listening to that greatest thing we can't do on our own that leads us to respond to the gospel. The gospel is good news for the problem we couldn't fix, the problem of our sin. When we respond to God and we experience His grace, it is a fresh start, a new beginning, a new birth, like a child who's resting securely in the arms of a great God. However you might be called or challenged by this passage, I would invite you to come while we stand, while we sing.